sensible, perfectly normal in their behaviours, they don't have the same warning signals that are telling them that they're drinking too much.
In 1944, Churchill was 70 and was drinking constantly throughout the working day. With this kind of pattern of consumption, he might have developed tolerance to alcohol. But over time, there can be other harmful effects.
It would be extremely unusual for somebody to be able to drink throughout the day, even small amounts, on a regular basis over a long period, and not have some harmful consequence of that.
For a man with Churchill's history, one of the most worrying of these long-term effects is the interaction between alcohol and depression.
Long-term alcohol abuse will probably make somebody's depression worse over time.
I think alcohol, although may give short-term relief to symptoms, often makes depressive symptoms worse.
As the crowds applauded him on VE Day, on the 8th of May 1945, Churchill must have been on a psychological high. But a downswing was to come sooner than Churchill could have predicted. Just 78 days later, a general election was held on the 25th of July 1945, and Churchill was voted out of office.
When the election results came along, I was in number 10 and I bumped into him. He said, "Mr. Kinner," he always called me Mr. Kinner, "come into the cabinet room and we'll have a chat." So he sat down and he was looking terribly miserable. And he started talking about the war and where we went. And then he had tears rolling down his cheeks. And he said, "And now the British people don't want me anymore." And I felt as though I wanted to cry too, because it was so tragic. This great man, full of confidence, has now said, "I'm not wanted anymore."
After his heroic leadership, after having been elevated to the very stars, after having been seen as the very personalization of the British character that carried Great Britain through those darkest days of the Blitz, for him then to have been voted out of office must have been such a profound blow. I find it almost unimaginable, and surely must have been a shattering psychological experience for him.
Churchill had often experienced depression, but by 1945, some argue that a second long-term effect of alcohol was coming into play, stripping away the mental vigor he used to rely on to fight depression.
Effects of alcohol on the brain are well documented. They directly kills off parts of the brain. Once that damage has occurred, for some people that's going to be irreparable.
The deleterious effects of alcohol on brain cells is well known. I think it's been said that with a martini you kill 100,000 brain cells, and I mean that may be over-dramatizing the case. But if you're doing this day in and day out, year in and year out, it can do nothing but augment the accelerated stages of aging of the brain.
And it was at this point, in the late 1940s, that a new and potentially life-threatening factor emerged. Churchill, like many people of his age, suffered from hypertension or high blood pressure, but this made him vulnerable to strokes.
When people have a stroke, the common cause is a blockage in the feeding artery going to the affected part of the brain. The bit of brain that is totally dependent on that artery will be irreparably damaged. Now, the things that cause that, age is the main factor. The arteries get a bit worn and harden as they age, but the main remediable cause of stroke is high blood pressure.
He had had hypertension for several years. He was he smoked cigars. He was a very avid drinker. He was reaching that age in which we begin to see strokes in the 70s. He was an accident waiting to happen.
All these risk factors collided in August 1949, while Churchill was holidaying on the Riviera with his old friend Max Beaverbrook, the newspaper baron, who owned the Daily Express and the London Evening Standard.
In 1949, Churchill was playing cards at Beaverbrooks, and in the middle of the game said, "I've got a tightness in my shoulder, and my arm and my leg don't feel quite right." It was a sensation, an abnormal sensation. This was clearly a stroke related to his underlying hypertension. It affected his right side.
He thought his career was over, and everybody else did too. But Max ruled the press pretty well, or suggested to his fellow rulers, and it was kept very, very quiet indeed.
His friends kept the news out of the papers, and Churchill clung on to fight the 1951 general election. But Dr. Moran, Churchill's private physician, had doubts about how well Churchill had really recovered. He has lost ground, and no longer has the same grip on things and events. If he wins the election, I doubt whether he's up to the job.
If one were presented with someone like Winston Churchill these days and asked, well, what about a check-up before re-election? And probably if a medical assessment had been done in an independent way, he would not have been allowed to go forward for election.
Without this kind of scrutiny, Churchill won the general election, and on the 26th of October 1951 became Prime Minister for the second time.
But as we pay our solemn tribute to our Prime Minister, we congratulate ourselves that in our darkest hour, the British Empire found her greatest Prime Minister.
By 1951, the Cold War was already at its height, and the world already knew the power of the nuclear bomb. At this volatile time in history, Britain's Prime Minister was 76 years old, and what's more, he had a history of depression and strokes. But Churchill's image of himself was still as the strong man of destiny, and he felt that there was another battle that he had to fight.
Churchill has this obsession with trying to end the Cold War. There is this almost monomaniacal belief that he could bring peace. And so even though he's been through the whole finest hour, he's had the whole man of destiny thing, he's still not satisfied. He wants to be a man of destiny yet again.
And Winston Churchill thought that he could achieve something if he met Stalin alone. And he thought that the problems could be ironed out, which was, I think, a thoroughgoing mistake in that way.
Churchill harked back to the great post-war summits. Then, he and the leaders of Russia and America met to decide on the peace settlement. But now, he failed to realize that the Cold War was different and couldn't be solved by personal meetings alone. With his mind firmly on the international scene, Churchill didn't always seem as interested in Britain's own vital post-war reconstruction. Nigel Nicholson, then a young Conservative MP, remembers meeting him in the House of Commons and trying to engage him on domestic issues.
Churchill was unresponsive, and he said to an older friend of ours later, "Who were those young men I was talking to in a smoking room? They're not members of our party, are they? They're just a set of pink pansies." Now,